Sup you beautiful people, hope you've had a fantastic day. Welcome back to another new episode of What If Naruto Was Shinobi Ashikabi. Don't forget to pay a visit to the author of this captivating fanfiction and show them some love. You'll find the link waiting for you down in the description. If you guys enjoy this what if, comment down below and let me know. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel after watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like and also share this video with your friends. So now let's start this video. Ha, you think you can beat me with those sucky moves? Oi, don't diss my moves you damned button masher. Unlike you, I actually use skill to earn my wins. Why don't you say that after you win a game against me, GRR, I'll show you how to play the game, bro. I swear I'll win this time. Good luck with that. Sitting on the large couch within his bedroom, Uzumaki Naruto found himself playing Street Fighter 4 for the PlayStation 3 against Uzume. They had been playing for the last hour or so, and so far they had played 10 rounds with Naruto winning each round by a landslide. Not that this surprised him in the least. When it came to video games or anything involving hands really, he was king. Currently, Naruto was playing as Cammy White, who was his favorite character because she was sexy, hot, kicked ass, and took names. She was like the perfect combination of all the things he loved in a woman rolled up into one tiny package. And while the immortal Uzumaki played using his favorite femme fatale, Uzume was playing as Ryu, who had some decent moves, but was far too slow a character in Naruto's opinion. Of course, he was probably biased against the person many people consider the face of Street Fighters, because Ryu wasn't an attractive female capable of kicking ass and taking names. If Naruto wanted to see a dude capable of kicking ass and taking names, he would just look at himself. He was better than Ryu was any day of the week. A regular hardcore badass who had graduated with top grades from the school of hardcore badassery. At least he was in his own mind. What the hell was that? Hess, you like it? That was my special move. Special move my ass? All you're doing is mashing buttons like a maniac on speed. Think whatever you like. You're just jealous of my mad skills. Naruto's fingers were a blur of motion as he pressed the buttons on his controller at speeds that would have probably broken any other controller. Fortunately for him, several seals had strategically painted onto his controller were able to keep it from turning into dust under the force of his light-speed fingers. He would have given himself a pat on the back for his foresight. Too bad he was too busy beating Uzume in another round to do so. No, 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 no. Uzume wailed in shock and despair as she watched Cammy deliver the fatal blow against Ryu by turning into what looked like a human drill and smashing into Ryu's stomach with her sexy legs. I can't believe it, you beat me again. She turned to glare at the blonde sitting next to her and glared at him. How do you keep beating me? Naruto sent Uzume a smug look. I'm just awesome like that. Uzume's right eye began twitching. When did you get so cocky, bro? When Naruto did nothing more than widen that blasted smile on his face, Uzume switched tactics. Whatever, let's go another round. I'll beat you this time for sure. I don't think so, Naruto said, the look of smug superiority still on his face. Only this time it was tinged with amusement when he saw Uzume's left eye join the right one in its twitching. You've had your 3 strikes, so now you're out. Why don't you let your cute Ashikabi play me now? I bet she'll give me a better challenge than you. At the mention of her Ashikabi, Uzume turned her head to look at Chiho, who was just sitting on the comfortable leather chair closest to her Sekirei. The girl had been sitting there since the beginning of what had turned into a battle royal between the cloth user and the enigmatic Uzumaki. Her hands were situated in her lap, and there was a placid smile on her face, as if just watching Uzume have fun brought her a kind of nirvana that few could or ever would achieve. That changed the moment Naruto said her name and Uzume turned to look at her. The girl's face turned a light shade of red at seeing her Sekirei and her savior both looking at her with equally intense expressions. You want me to play? Asked Chiho, her voice sounding like a mouse squeaking. I'm not sure I'd be very good, Naruto-san. I'm sure Uzume-chan can give you a much better challenge than I could. Uzume puffed out her chest at her Ashikabi's praise of her Street Fighter fighting skills, which consequently did some very nice things with her chest, as Naruto could attest to. Unfortunately, he couldn't let her ego get too big. Therefore, it was his job to burst her bubble before her head, inflated to such a proportion that it wouldn't be able to fit through his door. I doubt you could be any worse than Uzume, Naruto said dryly. He studiously ignored the loud oi coming from the cloth user. Remember, I just beat her 10 times in a row. I need someone new to give me a challenge, and seeing as you are the only other person in the room, that leaves you as the only option. He offered the girl a smile. I'm sure you'll do fine. And besides, it's not right for us to have all the fun playing video games while you sit there looking pretty. Chiho flushed, whether due to his smile or the looking pretty comment was unknown. Naruto figured it was a mixture of both. The lithe young woman wasn't very good at accepting compliments. He would have called her humble, but Naruto had a feeling there was another reason for her seeming inability to accept praise of any kind. Whatever the case was, it did not change the uncertain expression on Chiho's face. I don't know. Ah, come on, Chiho baby. Uzume thrust the controller into her Ashikabi's hand. Chiho blinked at the controller now in her hands with the same uncertainty she had when Naruto suggested she try her hand playing against him. You have to play and beat this jerk in my honor. At least give it a try. Chiho looked at the controller uncertainly. Naruto doubted the girl had ever played a video game before in her life. They didn't have any at the hospital, and while it was possible she had played some before the disease that had rendered her a paraplegic, he highly doubted the girl had even so much as touched a video game system. She seemed more like the type who enjoyed being outdoors and exploring than the kind of girl who would sit at home on her rear all day and play video games. Still, the lithe young woman seemed game. "Well, okay," she said, still sounding a tad uncertain. "I'll give it a try." Give what a try? The voice that came from the doorway had Uzume stiffening in both shock and fear. Chiho looked surprised as she turned her head to face the person the voice belonged to, but she didn't seem to be fearful as her Sekirei was. Probably because she had yet to actually be on the receiving end of the woman's Hanya mask. On the other side of things, Naruto was completely calm and composed as he looked at Mia while said woman stood in the doorway, one hand holding her broom while the other was on its handle, as if it were some kind of sword. Considering the way she was able to swing that thing, it might as well have been a sword. "Just what are you three doing?" asked Mia, her voice mild and her head tilted in what could be considered idle curiosity. There was a smile on her face, a very pleasant smile that had Uzume shuddering subconsciously in fear. "Ah, heh," Uzume squeaked out her usual laugh, though it sounded nothing like her normal amused laugh. "Well," she coughed into her hand, "we were just, watching bro here like you asked us to and, Her eyes darted to and fro as if looking for a miracle to save her, or perhaps an escape route should things turn sour. There were none. "And well, you know." "No, I don't know," Mia smiled pleasantly. "Why don't you enlighten me?" Uzume looked close to hyperventilating, much to the surprise of her Ashikabi, who wasn't entirely sure why her Sekirei looked so frightened by the pleasant landlady. Naruto knew why, of course. Mia could be damn scary when she wanted to be. He had seen her use that mask of hers to great effect. He wondered if she would use it here. One can always hope. "We're playing Street Fighter," Naruto told the purple-haired landlady, not at all afraid of repercussions unlike a certain veiled Sekirei. "It's a very fun game. Would you like to play, Mia-chan?" Mia's right eye twitched slightly before she regained her pleasant demeanor. "No, thank you. I am not really into computer games." "That's too bad." Naruto actually sounded somewhat despondent. He was sure that Mia would be killer at Street Fighters. As a general rule, people who followed the ways of the sword had more dexterity and strength in their fingers than most other people, ninjutsu users being an obvious exception, of course. This was no longer an applicable comparison, as the only ninjutsu user in the world was Naruto. "So did you need something?" There were several seconds of silence as Mia stared at Naruto, her beautiful face set in that gorgeous smile she always had on. The look did not fool Naruto. He knew she was annoyed with him, both because of his immunity to her fear tactics and because he more or less refused to comply with her demands, though it would be slightly inaccurate to say he did not acquiesce to them. He had confined himself to his room after the Matsu incident as she had requested. It just so happened that keeping him confined in the space where he had set up shop, so to speak, was not conducive to keeping him from enjoying himself. Ah, the joys of video games. One of the few inventions in this world that humanity made right. Mia sighed, obviously realizing this fact. He wondered if she was going to admit defeat or just tactically retreat and do some reconnaissance on him until she had a clearer idea of how to properly chastise him. He wished her luck with that. "I came to inform you that Tsukiyumi is awake," Mia told him. Now that got Naruto's attention. It also seemed to get the attention of both Chiho and Uzume if their neck-breaking head turns were any indication. "She woke up just a few moments ago while I was about to get rid of her bandages." "And how is she?" asked Naruto, trying not to let anything show on his face. He wouldn't necessarily say he was worried about the number 09, but he had felt a bit apprehensive about how she would react once she had woken up. Given that she was tsundere, it wouldn't surprise him if she started shouting and causing a ruckus. She is fine, Mia assured the blonde. Naruto noticed her smile widen and wondered if perhaps his carefully constructed mask of indifference was not as solid as he assumed it was. She was a little disoriented when she woke up, but after I informed her of her whereabouts and how she got here, she seemed to calm down. That's good, Naruto sighed in relief. The last thing he needed was for Tsukiyomi to freak out over finding herself in a new and strange place that she had never seen before. That she was a Sekirei only made it worse. That her power was over water made the magnitude of how catastrophic such an event could be raised by a factor of at least 10. Water and Japanese-style houses such as this just did not mix. On that note, maybe he should think of putting up seals that would prevent water damage. It was something to think about at least. She wanted to see you, Mia started again. That's actually why I'm here. Oh, Naruto couldn't help but grin at her words. But I thought I was grounded, Mom. There was a definite tone of sarcasm in the blonde's voice, and Mia noticed it instantly. If that's the case, then perhaps I should take out all of your video games and that television of yours so that you don't have anything to occupy your time with, Mia suggested with a smile so pleasant it sent chills down Naruto's back. Uzume and Chiho didn't look much better. Maybe then you'll actually reflect on why I had you stay in your room in the first place. Naruto felt like someone had punched him in the gut. To be more specific, it felt like Tsunade had punched him in the gut using her full strength. Would Mia really take away the only form of entertainment humans had connived in the past several thousand years that he could actually enjoy? She couldn't do that, could she? You wouldn't do that, would you, Mia? Mia's smile just widened. For the first time in a long time, Naruto felt truly uncertain about his position. Maybe he should have just stayed silent. A frown marred his face as he stood in front of the door that led to Tsukiyomi's room. A part of his displeased expression, he knew, came from the fact that Mia finally had something over him with which she could use to make him do things he might be otherwise predisposed towards not doing. He cursed at himself for being stupid enough to actually give away his one weakness, not including ramen. Still, it wasn't like this was the end of the world. He doubted Mia would actually take away his video game system. She may threaten him, but even she knew there were lines that could not be crossed. And even if she did, it wasn't like Naruto couldn't just steal it back. His skills in stealth were second to none. Yes, everything would be fine. He wouldn't lose the one thing humanity made that he couldn't criticize in any way to Mia. Well, a voice from behind startled the blonde Uzumaki from his thoughts. Are you going to go in or just stand there? Naruto turned his head ever so slightly to see Mia standing behind him, that ever-pleasant smile on her face. He gave her a slightly annoyed look. Why are you following me? He asked plainly. After that fiasco in his room where Mia had discovered one of his few mortal weaknesses, he had hightailed it out of there in his haste to not only make a tactical withdrawal from the situation. Naruto did not run away, but also get away from Mia. Naturally, that last part had become a non-factor since she had followed him. Seeing as how I can no longer trust you not to give in to your beastly desires and take advantage of all these women you have bound to yourself, I have decided it would be best if I came with you when you speak to Tsukiyomi. Naruto's eyes began twitching. The way she said that made it sound like that moment back in Matsu's room was all his fault and not that of his most perverted Sekirei. This is simply to ensure that you do not do anything immodest, Naruto-san. Ouch. She was actually using the less personal and affectionate suffix on him. He must have really pissed her off. Right, Naruto decided it was best to just not argue with the purple-haired landlady on this. Though if he were honest with himself, he had to question her no lewd acts policy. She had been a married woman at one point, so unless she was a prude who had never experienced the act of being intimate with her husband, she had most likely committed these lewd acts herself at some time during the past. So why then was she so set against other people doing them now? From what he understood, the bond between Sekirei and Ashikabi was that of a metaphysical and empathic connection that was formed around the love a Sekirei had for their Ashikabi. If one were to think of it that way, then a Sekirei bond was akin to marriage, only it was more powerful and could not be broken like how most human marriage often broke. Maybe she was like this simply because she was bitter since she was no longer getting any. It made sense to him, though he would never actually speak these thoughts out loud. While he picked on her and got on her nerves a lot, he did actually like the woman. His eyes landed back on the door that led to Tsukiyomi's room, a frown appearing on his face. Naruto was not sure why, but for whatever reason he was feeling inexplicably nervous about entering the room and talking to the number 09. While feeling nervous was not completely foreign to him, The blonde Uzumaki could not understand why he felt this way. He had no reason to feel any form anxiety, yet for some reason he was. Naruto-kun, a soft, feminine hand landed on his shoulder. Naruto looked down to see the surprisingly delicate fingers and soft-looking smooth skin of Mia's hand. It was always a surprise to see just how pristine the woman's body was. Despite being a powerful Sekirei who was well-versed with a sword and spent much of her time laboring around the inn, her skin remained perfect. There were no calluses from hard labor or the sword she wielded. He could not see any scars on what parts her body he had managed to catch a glimpse of. It was very different from the kunoichi of his area, who while very beautiful often had physical evidence of the training they did and the battles they fought. His head followed the hand to the wrist it was connected to, which faded into the voluminous light purple sleeves of Mia's kimono. His eyes traveled up the sleeves towards the woman's shoulder, then face. She was giving him a look of mild concern. Both eyes were open and studying him intently. "I'm fine," he assured the purple-haired landlady. She did not look very convinced, but seemed to decide it was best not to argue. With a final squeeze of reassurance, her hand left his shoulder and came back to her side. Taking a deep breath and releasing it, Naruto did what he could to dispel his strange case of nervousness, reached for the handle, and pulled the door open. He walked into the room, Mia following behind him, and took a quick look around. It looked just as the same as it had the last time he was in here. The only difference now was that Tsukiyumi was wide awake and no longer covered in bandages. Said woman was currently sitting up straight, the covers of her futon only covering the lower half of her body, while her torso was covered by a large white t-shirt that Naruto guessed had once belonged to Mia's husband due to it being several sizes too large for the woman in question to wear. Tsukiyumi had noticed his presence as soon as he entered the room, perhaps even before that. Her head had snapped over in his direction when the door opened and he stepped inside. The moment he had, her eyes widened before her cheeks took on the shade of a boiled lobster. She had quickly looked down at her hands as they wrung themselves on her lap, though every now and again her eyes would flicker to him, their startling blue color just visible beneath the fringe of her hair. It was ridiculously adorable. "I'm glad to see you're awake." Naruto broke the silence as he moved further into the room and sat down next to Tsukiyumi's futon in seiza. His words caused Tsukiyumi's already flushed cheeks to darken, something Naruto would have not thought possible were he not seeing it with his own eyes. "How are you feeling?" I am fine," Tsukiyumi muttered, her embarrassment welling up for a second. Of course, being tsundere meant the Dara moment did not last long. She looked up at him just a few seconds later, a fire in her eyes. Her back straightened and she sniffed haughtily, her looks and expression making her look like one of those arrogant yet very beautiful princesses people sometimes read about in stories. "But this does not surprise me, I am the strongest after all." Naruto cracked a smile. "That's good to hear. I was pretty worried about you when you fainted on me," Naruto's admitted a bit reluctantly. He hated admitting his weaknesses, especially when it dealt with a weakness towards others. Tsukiyumi's face went straight from arrogant and haughty to embarrassed and shy in less than 2.5 seconds. "You've been sleeping for a long time now," Naruto continued, taking note of the woman's reaction. 18 hours to be precise. "Has it really been that long?" asked Tsukiyumi, her voice conveying her shock. So was her face for that matter. Her eyes were wide and her mouth looked like it was struggling not to hang open. "Yes," Naruto gave her a solemn nod. "Which reminds me, just how long were you running from those guys?" "I was not running." Tsukiyumi's shocked expression gave way to a fierce scowl at the untactful mentioning of her strategic withdrawal. "I would never run away from honorable combat. Those damn dogs fought dirty, ganging up on me as they did. They did not even have the common courtesy of giving me their name and number." A chuckle almost escaped his lips at the indignation on Tsukiyumi's face. The look was almost endearing. He did not laugh for one of two reasons, however. For one, she would have gone all soon on him if he did. He knew her type well enough, and he simply had no real desire to deal with a tsundere at the moment. Another reason was because there were more important matters to discuss, and he did not want the blonde-haired Sekirei getting distracted. So, it took a moment for Naruto to realize he had no clue how he was supposed to go about this particular conversation. Really, just how do you ask a super-powered tsundere alien, who you had just rescued a little less than a day ago, if she was still interested in getting her wings without sounding like a pompous and impatient ass? That type of conversation was difficult enough on its own, without adding in the awkward fact that this woman was the kind who would more than likely react violently when an embarrassing topic was brought up. "I hope you plan on taking responsibility for me." Fortunately for him, It seemed as if Tsukiyumi had no problem bringing up their previous point of contention. Though perhaps contention was not quite the best word to describe this topic. It wasn't like they had debated about this before. In fact, they hadn't actually argued the point at all. Tsukiyumi had pretty much told him point blank that he was going to take responsibility for her. Of course, all this happened right before she passed out, which led to the current situation they had found themselves in. He wondered if this was karma, and if so, was it good or bad? Oh my, Mia's voice came from the background, bringing both Tsukiyumi's attention and Naruto's, who had almost forgotten the woman was there, onto her. You are? Tsukiyumi's face scrunched up in thought as she stared at the purple-haired woman. Naruto couldn't help but find it strangely cute. Damned tsunderes. The woman who was changing my bandages. I'm so glad you remembered me. Mia gave Tsukiyumi a gentle smile. My name is Asama Mia. I am both the proprietor and landlady of Maison Izumo, which you currently reside in. I see. In any event, Naruto began again, hoping to get the ball rolling on the topic he had been trying to keep them on before anyone else could say anything to derail them. I have every intention of taking responsibility for you, especially after all the trouble I went through to rescue you from Mikagami's hounds. HMPH, I did not need saving. And of course, that was the only thing Tsukiyumi took out of his words. The woman seemed quite indignant at the mere mentioning of how Naruto had saved her from a fate worse than death for Sekirei. I am the strongest Sekirei. I do not need some monkey to protect me. Naruto felt his eyes twitch slightly. This girl was a real piece of work. Still, it wouldn't do to get angry. She was tsundere, he reminded himself. This was just how she was. Then, pray tell, why had you captured by those 3 Sekirei when I first found you? That. Tsukiyumi's face turned red, though whether it was from embarrassment, anger, or a combination of the two was unknown. After a moment or two of flushing and sputtering, she turned her head and let out a huff. As I said before, they had fought using cowardly and dishonorable tactics. Had I fought any of them one-on-one, it would have been I that claimed victory. But they didn't fight you one-on-one, and you had been captured by the time I arrived, and would have been taken to Mikagami to be forcefully winged had I not intervened. Naruto gave a satisfied smile as he presented the blonde-haired beauty his flawless logic. There was no way she could argue against this point without sounding like an idiot. Which means I did save you. Tsukiyumi stared at him. Despite the fact that only a second passed in real time, the intensity of the stare seemed to stretch that single second to well over several minutes. Naruto wondered if all females were capable of similar feats, as he had yet to meet a woman who was not able to perform something comparable to the look he was receiving now. After the second passed, Tsukiyumi's cheeks took on a light pink hue. She turned her head a bit and closed her eyes. "WL," she started, sounding both nervous and self-conscious. "I suppose you did at that. For a monkey, you are quite courageous." Naruto almost snorted at the woman's words. It was both amusing and annoying to see the woman trying to save face by insulting him and giving him a backhand compliment at the same time. But then, had he really expected anything less from this woman? "Are you sure this is what you want?" asked Naruto, his expression shifting from slightly amused to serious. Tsukiyumi looked startled, though the blonde was not sure if the look was because of his change in demeanor or his words. "Once you gain your wings, you won't be able to take them back. Are sure you want this?" In most circumstances, Naruto probably wouldn't have asked that question. As a general principle, most Sekirei were eager, nay, obsessed with finding their Ashikabi and gaining their wings. And while he was positive Tsukiyumi was the same way, albeit not willing to show it because she was tsundere, he wanted to be 100% sure this was what she wanted before they went through with this. "Of course I am sure," Tsukiyumi huffed, her arms crossing over her chest as an indignant expression appeared on her face. She looked insulted that Naruto would ask her such a question after she had just finished telling him that he had to take responsibility for her. "Do not make me repeat myself." "Right, sorry," Naruto apologized, though it was easy for most people to tell from the amused undertone in his voice that he was not being sincere in his apology. Fortunately for him, while Mia knew this and had covered her mouth with the left sleeve of her kimono to hide her giggling, Tsukiyumi did not seem to recognize the tone of amusement in his voice and gave him a nod as if to accept his apology. "Apology accepted," she said imperiously, not even realizing that Naruto had not been making a serious apology. "So," Naruto started, shifting his body so that instead of sitting Seiza he was sitting with his legs crossed. "I suppose we should get you your wings then." "Why yes." Tsukiyumi's face began to flush pink as she started stumbling over her words. "I guess we should." The blonde-haired Sekirei trailed off. the pink hue of her cheeks darkening as she bent her head down so that her hair was hovering over her eyes, leaving only a little bit of those clear blue irises visible as she worried her lower lip. Naruto was once again struck speechless by the blonde woman's beauty. Her face was flawless save for two soft red stains on her cheeks that contrasted beautifully with her pale skin. The way she looked so demure and shy was absolutely breathtaking. Her pouty lips looked utterly kissable. In that moment, Naruto wanted nothing more than to claim those lips with his own. He wanted to take this woman in his arms and ravish her mouth until her toes curled and her knees grew weak. He wanted her badly, he just couldn't understand it. How in the hell could someone with so much potential for violence be so goddamn seductive and adorable? And fuck, how could anyone be both seductive and adorable at the same time? Those two words shouldn't even belong in the same sentence, much less being used to describe the same person. Damn tsundere. Doing his best to shake all thoughts of how attractive tsunderes with Nidame-like powers over water were, Naruto reached out towards Tsukuyomi with his left hand. He placed it under her head, cupping her chin so that he could turn her head towards him. Her eyes were staring up at him through the fringe of her blonde bangs, looking both eager and uncertain. Her cheeks were flaring up like a red star. Her breathing was getting heavier as the emotions from her reaction began increasing. It seemed she had been holding it in since he had appeared before her. Naruto tilted Tsukuyomi's head up and bent his down to meet her mouth in a kiss. The first thing that went through his head was about how right he had been. Tsukuyomi's lips were incredibly kissable. They were warm and soft, slightly moist and tasted of the sea. Surprisingly, the salty taste of her lips enhanced the kiss rather than detract from it. For a moment, Naruto wondered if the reason he found this kiss so incredibly was because it was the first one he had given willingly, of his own accord with no outside influence and no bond to addle his thoughts. There was a distinct possibility that was the case. So far as he knew, all of his previous wingings had more to do with the bond forming without his knowledge and forcing his Sekirei's emotions onto him, with the exception of Matsu, who he was essentially guilted into winging. Even his winging of Hamura had more to do with the bond than any desire to actually wing the gender-confused Sekirei. This would be the first time Naruto had willingly allowed himself to grant a Sekirei wings without being influenced by anything other than his own desires. Of course, these thoughts fled him mere seconds after coming to his mind, and any other theories he may have come up with left him seconds after entering, and all the blonde immortal could find himself focusing on was this ridiculously beautiful woman and the feel of her lips pressed firmly against his own. Naruto's eyes began to flutter closed as the kiss began to grow more passionate. He could feel Tsukuyomi melding into him. Her lips seemed to fit with his own perfectly. Her breasts were pressing against his chest, and it was all he could do not to lift a hand and begin groping them through the material of her clothes. Had he kept his eyes open, he would have seen the wings flaring into existence behind Tsukuyomi. Though the term flaring into existence may not have been an apt one to use in this instance. It started at the Sekirei crest, which was burning brightly on the upper part of Tsukuyomi's back right in between the shoulder blades where the back attached itself to the neck. Water, small droplets of precipitation began gathering near the crest. They coalesced into existence, molecule by molecule, first in ones, then twos, threes, more and more began gathering around the crest at an ever-increasing rate, until there were literally multiple jets of water streaming in towards the woman's back like a couple hoses. The water continued to flow towards Tsukuyomi's back, defying the laws of physics as it began to take shape and grow. Starting from the crest and moving outward, large wings like those of an angel spread out behind Tsukuyomi's back. The two great wings that were taller than Naruto when he stood at full height stretched out behind the blonde Sekirei, bending when they were impeded from reaching their full length by the ceiling. They pressed against the plaster ceiling, bending like some kind of organic material without bones, instead of a liquid that should have not been able to hold any form. Despite how the two wings were being pressed against the ceiling and their tips touching the walls, nothing they touched actually got wet. However, Naruto saw none of this. All he saw were the backs of his eyelids as he and Tsukuyomi continued to kiss. All he felt were her lips as they pressed against his, her tongue as it grazed against his teeth, his tongue, his mouth. Nothing else mattered to him right now. There was nothing else except this woman, this amazing, incredible vision of beauty who had somehow managed to light a fire under him. Had he been in the right state of mind, he probably would have wondered why his body was reacting like an overly hormonal teenager on Viagra. As things stood, he wouldn't have been capable of thinking straight even if he wanted to. Naruto did not know how long he and Tsukiyomi remained where they were, kissing feverishly as if they were trying to consume the other. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. The only reason Naruto even stopped was because of the hand that had clamped down on his shoulder. The action was startling enough that the blonde shinobi managed to somehow pry his mouth off of Tsukiyomi's. Even then, it took an astonishing amount of willpower, and the needy whimper that came from the newest member of his flock certainly did not help matters. Gods, did every female Sekirei just emit sexy naturally? I believe you two have been at this for quite long enough, Mia said, her voice strained. As Tsukiyomi began to calm down her raging libido, which was replaced with mortification as soon as she remembered she and Naruto had not been alone in the room, Naruto turned to look at the woman who had pulled him from his own lust-induced haze. He blinked several times as his mind came down from what almost felt like a post-orgasmic high before he was able to properly look at the woman grasping his shoulder. It was probably the first time he had ever seen Mia look so embarrassed. Granted, he had seen her embarrassed before, back when they had their mutual apology during that time when Naruto had discovered her and Matsu spying on him when he healed Hamura. But even though he had seen her embarrassed, he had never seen her quite so flustered. Yes, flustered was a good word, he decided. Not even when she had caught him going down on Matsu had she looked as flustered as she did now. Then again, she had come after the fact, not during. Thinking back on that incident, he had to wonder how she knew what was happening, as well as why she had come after the deed had already been done and not before or during the event to stop it. It was just didn't fit with what he knew of Mia to not make a preemptive attempt at stopping him from releasing his beastly urges, as the purple-haired landlady was so fond of saying. Well, he supposed it didn't matter in the end. And thinking about it too much gave him a headache at the moment anyways. Best not to think about it. Just don't think about it, Naruto. Right, Naruto said. It was only now, after he had finished talking, that he realized just how short of breath he was. That was surprising. Naruto had always been a stamina freak, even before he gained his immortality. A combination of his Uzumaki bloodline and Kurama being sealed inside of him had ensured that he would almost never run out of energy. That stamina had increased to levels unheard of since then, and now there was not a soul in this universe who could probably outlast him in anything. Shaking that thought off, Naruto took a quick moment to check himself over. He only needed a minute to take stock of himself. Aside from being short of breath, his face felt hot. It felt almost like someone had stuck his body in a furnace. His body was slightly sweaty from his exertions, which was surprising because he and Tsukiyomi had only kissed. At least that's what he thought until his mind began taking stock of the rest of his surroundings. It was only seconds later that he realized his position and Tsukiyomi's had changed sometime during their kiss. The first thing he noticed was that he was no longer sitting with his legs crossed. Instead, they had been straightened in front of him. He could only assume his body had reacted instinctively to the weight on top of him. He was also leaning backwards, with his left hand positioned behind him to act as his support pillar. This was probably due to the pressure being exerted on his chest, and that was when he noticed Tsukiyomi's position. She was the weight currently pressing down on his legs. Sometime during the kiss she had moved. That, or he had pulled her onto him. Where once she had been sitting on her futon with the covers hiding the lower half of her body, now she was sitting on top of him, her wonderful, mile-long legs straddling his thighs. At some point during the kiss, or was that kisses, Naruto's right arm had wrapped itself around the blonde-haired Sekirei. This lent some credence to his theory of him pulling Tsukiyomi to him. Though he liked to think she had moved of her own accord, the last thing he felt were Tsukiyomi's hands. They were pressing themselves firmly against his chest, under his shirt. Naruto shuddered, and it took everything he had not to fall back into a lust-induced haze, as he realized that sometime during their kiss-make-out session, Tsukiyomi had buried her hands under his shirt to caress his well-formed pectoral and abdominal muscles without being hindered by any fabric. He was actually surprised that was the last thing he noticed. One would think that feeling the warm, delicate hands of a female touching them anywhere would be the first thing someone noticed. Then again, having the warm, beautiful body of said female those hands belonged to currently straddling him was making it very difficult for Naruto to think at all. Tsukiyomi also seemed to have noticed their change in position. Her eyes, which had already been wide from having realized Mia was still in the room with them, widened even more. They were so wide, in fact, that they looked comical. Her eyes reminded him of that American cartoon character, Daffy Duck, when he was surprised. The blonde-haired Sekirei's face began to turn red. starting from the twin spots of bright warmth on her cheeks and slowly spreading to the rest of her face. From the roots of her hair to well past her neck, Tsukiyumi's face, and at the very least the upper half of her body, began taking on the same shade as a boiled lobster. Her pupils dilated as a look of horrific embarrassment crossed her face. Naruto only had enough time for one word when he realized what was about to happen. Shit. Water celebration. Murphy was definitely against him, Naruto decided. He just couldn't get a break. Did you really have to soak me like that? Naruto's eyes twitched violently as he walked down the hall towards the living room. Walking at his side was Tsukiyumi, her cheeks slightly pink due to what she had done to him while both her arms clung to his left one. Despite her obvious embarrassment over having smacked him face first with what was essentially a large ball of condensed water, she seemed to be unwilling to admit to being at fault. It is not my fault. The flush on Tsukiyumi's cheeks deepened just at the mere mention of their kiss within the room she had been sleeping in, even if it was just indirectly mentioned. Honestly, you should not have been so forward with me. I was under the impression that in order to gain your wings, a kiss was required due to the exchange of DNA through mucosal contact. Naruto replied to her words in a dry tone of voice. If that is not the case, then please correct me. Was there anything else I could have done to avoid getting hit by a ball of water? Your sarcasm is unappreciated, Tsukiyumi mumbled, sounding both angry and embarrassed. Not that Naruto particularly cared how embarrassed she was at this moment. After all, he was the one who had suffered from her reaction. Or was that overreaction? Behind them, Mia raised an arm to hide her mouth behind the sleeves of her kimono and giggled. Something amusing you, Mia-chan? Asked Naruto as he turned his head slightly so he could look at her out of the corner of his left eye, with her eyes alight with thinly veiled mirth. The tiny, amused smile he knew she was sporting behind the fabric of her kimono, and the soft, tinkling bell-like giggle that escaped her lips. Naruto knew the landlady of Mason Izumo was finding this whole situation far too amusing for her own good. Oh no, Mia assured him, those purple orbs barely visible behind half-lidded eyes. I assure you, there is absolutely nothing amusing about seeing you soaking wet. The way she spoke with such a bemused undertone did very little to assure him that her words were true. In fact, they did the exact opposite, or getting hit by a ball of water. I'm sure, Naruto murmured as he and the two women with him came to the shoji screen door leading into the living room. Without much hesitation on his part, Naruto opened the door and stepped inside. An embarrassed Tsukiyumi who was trying to mask said embarrassment behind a haughty exterior, and a giggling Mia right behind him. While no one was inside of the room, a quick look at the opposite end revealed Akitsu and Kusano sitting out on the veranda just outside of the shoji screen doors. The youngest of his Sekirei was sitting on the snow woman's lap playing with the cold beauty's white locks. As was per usual, the second member of his flock was allowing the girl and tug and pull on her hair with the patience of a saint. Judging from the grunts and shouts coming from outside, Naruto correctly deduced that Musubi was shadow sparring or just going through her forms, what forms there were. It was something he had come to expect from her. When not spending time with him or sparring with Mia, the most naive of his Sekirei could often be found trying to perfect her technique. As if to prove his theory, a second later Musubi became visible as she moved across the courtyard, juking and weaving as she launched kicks and punches at her imaginary opponents. She was getting much better, he had to admit, though she still had far too many holes in her defense for his liking. He counted at least 5 within the first few seconds of the exchange he saw. It was something he would eventually need to work with her on, as only another taijutsu user would be able to properly help tighten her form. His presence did not go unnoticed as he stepped further into the room. Kusano, who was sitting perpendicular to Akitsu, noticed him out of the corner of her eye. The young girl's eyes lit up like twin beacons in the night. A smile so wide you could land an airplane on it crossed her face, and her entire body seemed to radiate a joy that could not be contained. It was absolutely adorable. It was also very disturbing. Oni-chan, the tiny titan, scrambled to get off Akitsu's lap and made a mad dash towards her big brother, her tiny arms open wide as if to engulf him in her embrace. Unfortunately for her, she was much too small to actually engulf him in a hug. That, and she only reached up to his knees, but she did manage to latch onto his left leg like some kind of adorable leech. The tiny blonde looked up at him with a big, bright smile, and Naruto found it incredibly difficult not to return the look. Bending down, he picked the littlest of his Sekirei up. Kusano allowed him to scoop her into his arms, and quickly latched her own tiny arms around his neck as he cradled her to him like a father would their child. Kuchan, Naruto greeted, hesitating for only a moment before placing a kiss on her temple. The tiny terror with teeth sharper than Hoshigaki Kasame giggled uncontrollably, her cheeks slightly flushed from the contact between them. Have you been a good girl for a Ki-chan? MMHMM, Kusano nodded her head vigorously. Kuchan's been a good girl. Naruto's lips turned themselves into a tiny half-grin at the girl's words. He would have responded to them, but before he could another voice spoke up. Husband, who is this? Naruto felt like palming his face as he realized that he had not only not introduced Tsukiyomi to her sister Sekirei, kind of hard to do that when she's been unconscious since before they got to Mason Izumo, she also did not even know he had more than one Sekirei. This was not good. How was he going to tell Tsukiyomi that she was not his first Sekirei, or even his second, but his sixth without her going all tsun on him? Was there even anything he could say that would not lead to potential tsuning violence? If this girl was anything like the other tsunderes he'd met in his life, probably not. Wait, did she just call him husband? Before Naruto could open his mouth to ask her about his apparent new title, the jingling and clinking of chains alerted him to Akitsu's presence. He looked over to see the woman standing up from where she had been sitting on the veranda. She walked over to him with her slow, methodical steps until she was standing in front of him, her head bowed deferentially. Ashikabi-sama, she greeted. Tsukiyomi furrowed her brow. Ashikabi-sama, Akitsu-chan, Naruto greeted quickly, hoping to head off Tsukiyomi's thought pattern by initiating a conversation with the white-haired ice user. At the very least, he wanted this conversation out of the way before his newest Sekirei starting tossing condensed balls of water at him again. Was Kuchan any trouble? Ah, Akitsu shook her head. No, Mu, Kusano gave Naruto an irritated look that was far too adorable for her own good. Kuchan already told Oni-chan she was good. Naruto chuckled a bit, while a little ways behind him Mia gave a soft giggle. Husband, Tsukiyomi did not seem to like being ignored. Not that Naruto was actually ignoring her, he just wasn't sure what to say to her that would allow him to avoid a potentially volatile situation yet, but it most definitely looked that way to her. Who is this child that is clinging to you like some kind of leech? And who is this woman who calls you Ashikabi-sama? What is going on here? Even if Naruto were inclined to answer her question, which if he were honest he was not entirely sure how to answer, another interruption came in the form of a certain battle-crazy Sekirei in shrine maiden clothing. Musubi, who had previously been practicing outside on her own while Akitsu and Kusano watched on, had come inside the living room, presumably to see what the fuss was all about. The moment she saw Naruto, her face lit up in a way that was not dissimilar to the way Kusano's had. Body of a woman, mind of a child, that was Musubi to a T. Naruto-sama, the shrine maiden with an unhealthy love for combat, ran up to the growing group of people with a bright smile. I'm glad Landlady-sama has finally let you come outside. Musubi began pouting. I haven't been able to see you since you came back. I'm sorry, Musubi-chan. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck, not exactly sure what he should say in a situation like this. Would it be appropriate to reassure her? Or should he correct her and inform her that Mia hadn't technically let him out of his room, just decided it was pointless since all that meant was he and Uzume would be playing video games? Seriously, this whole Ashikabi business was starting to become a headache, or maybe he was just overthinking things. Mu, it's fine. Musubi waved off his apology with a bright smile. I'm just glad I can see you again. It was very hard for Naruto not to return the excited girl's smile. He could literally feel her happiness radiating outward from their bond. Her joy at just seeing him was so profound, there were simply no words to describe it. Naruto doubted there would be anyone in the world who could see that smile and not be affected. Well, Naruto could name at least one person who did not seem to be affected. Husband, Tsukiyomi ground out in anger. Her eyes flickered from the blonde male with whiskers to the three new girls that surrounded him. Who are these? These girls? Naruto sensed the potential tsun situation from a mile away. It looked like Mount Tsukiyomi would soon erupt in fiery, or is that watery, fury if he did not answer in a way that appeased to her sensibilities. Unfortunately, he could not think of any answer that would actually do that. Who is this, Naruto-sama? Asked a curious Musubi. She was of course asking about Tsukiyomi, who she had yet to meet due to her being out in Shinto Tado searching for him after Seo had called Matsu, and informed her that he had decided to leave the scruffy-looking Ashikabi in order to rescue said water user. Naruto was actually very glad for the opening she had unwittingly given him. This is Tsukiyomi, Naruto introduced said woman, who currently had her arms crossed under her bust and was giving Musubi an imperious glare while she tried to figure out the shrine maiden's connection to him. She's the number 09, you know, the one I've been dreaming about. Ah, Musubi gasped in both surprise and excitement. It didn't last long, but for just a second, Naruto could have sworn sparkles appeared within the girl's eyes as she looked between him and Tsukiyomi. Then, is she your newest Sekirei? Naruto shifted a bit. Yes, this is great, Musubi crowed, her left hand clenching into a fist as she pumped it into the air. It was not unexpected, but it seemed like Musubi was even more excited about Naruto adding another female to his flock than he was. You've got another one. And a single digit too, another one. There was a tremor in Tsukiyomi's voice, one that promised violence. A quick look at the blonde-haired Sekirei showed that the expression on her face matched the tone of her voice to a T. Her eyes were twitching quite violently, and several strands of her long hair was swaying in an unseen breeze. For a moment, Naruto wondered if she was manipulating the water molecules within the air to accomplish such a feat with her hair, but was forced to disregard that thought when Tsukiyomi's tsun voice sounded again. Husband, do you mean to tell me that I am not your first? No, Naruto sighed. There really was no right way to answer this, and it seemed that delaying tactics would no longer work. Best to just get this situation over with and hope for the best. You are not. I see. Her lips twitching like she wanted to peel them back from her teeth to snarl at him, Tsukiyomi continued her questioning. And aside from me, just how many Sekirei do you have? Well, Naruto blinked several times, then looked up at the ceiling as if he were counting in his head. Five. The twitching of Tsukiyomi's eyes became even more pronounced as, without warning, she raised her hand towards Naruto, water gathering around her palm like streamers. Water celebration, 2 times in one day. Murphy must really hate him right now. Dinner that day was a very interesting affair, not to say that it wasn't always interesting. With so many different people with different personalities coming together to share a meal with each other, dinner was always an interesting and very loud affair. But today, dinner was even more interesting than usual. The reason for this could easily be attributed to Tsukiyomi, Sekirei number 09, the Water Sekirei, and the newest member of Naruto's increasingly large harem. Even now, that term was something Naruto would have never believed could apply to him. They were just words that had never held any meaning. While other males might find the idea of a harem awesome, Naruto just never cared. What would he need a harem for anyways? They would just die less than 100 years from now. It was funny how life worked out. The one person who would never want a harem was one of the few people who had somehow found himself acquiring multiple female partners. Ridiculously hot female partners that came from another planet, had supernatural powers, were currently fighting in some kind of strange game being run by a madman, and wanted to have his babies. When did his life become like an eroge? Naruto turned his head slightly to look at Tsukiyomi. She was sitting directly on his left, a place where Musubi or Akitsu would normally sit depending on what day it was. Today, the water user had taken that spot, though taken might be a bit of an understatement in this instance. The blonde female had practically demanded the right to sit next to him. Of course, being who she was, Musubi had agreed that it was only right since Tsukiyomi was the newest Sekirei to their family. Akitsu just hadn't felt like arguing, though Naruto got the distinct impression that the taciturn woman had been tempted to impale Tsukiyomi with a large spear of ice. Tsukiyomi was eating the food he had prepared with a regal grace that was offset by just how fast she was eating. Naruto was beginning to wonder if all Sekirei just had Akimichi-like appetites. Seriously, so far every Sekirei he met seemed capable of putting away nearly twice their body weight in food. Even Kusano ate like it was going out of style. She was also glaring at Hamura with a narrowed gaze as said fire user sat directly across from her, eating her own meal at a sedate pace whilst trying to ignore the eyes that were drilling into her head. She wasn't doing a very good job. Can I help you? Asked Hamura with a sigh after finishing another bite of food, obviously no longer able to ignore the glaring woman sitting across from him. You, Tsukiyomi muttered, her eyes narrowing even further as she leaned forward slightly, as if doing so would help her observe the white-haired fire user better. You look very familiar, she continued slowly, her words causing Hamura to nearly choke on the air he had just inhaled. Have we met before? Hamura coughed several times, each time banging a fist against his chest as he tried to dislodge something that wasn't even there from within his throat. After a moment, he seemed to regain control over his lungs and quickly turned his head away from the water using tsundere nervously. I can't say that we have, he replied in a neutral, careful voice. Naruto rolled his eyes from where he sat. He didn't know why Hamura was trying to hide who he was to the woman he apparently had some history with. If there was one thing Naruto had learned in his long life, it was that in a situation like this, the truth will always come out no matter how hard you try to hide it, and the longer you try to hide it, the worse the reaction you get will be. Considering Tsukiyomi was a tsundere, the chance said reaction will be incredibly violent increased astronomically. Tsukiyomi continued to stare at Hamura for several more seconds. The gender-confused Sekirei being stared at just tried to ignore the look as much as possible, though Naruto thought the pale-skinned fire user looked a tad nervous. After a moment or two longer, Tsukiyomi leaned back, seemingly satisfied with her observations. "I suppose not," she said at last, before picking up her bowl of rice and a set of chopsticks. Hamura sighed in relief before picking up the steaming cup of tea near his plate. "Though you do look familiar, the one I am thinking of is a man that wears a mask." Hamura, who had just began drinking some of the tea set out for him, did a classical spit take at those words, spewing tea all over the table and some of the food. "Hamura," Mia exclaimed in surprise while everyone else voiced their own exclamations. "I'm not a woman," Hamura growled angrily as he stood up and glared at Tsukiyomi, who actually looked surprised by the white-haired fire user's sudden anger. "I'm a man, Naruto sighed as Kusano buried her face into his torso, as if doing so would allow her to escape the fire user's wrath, even though none of it was directed at her. Likewise, Musubi seemed to be frightened by the intensity of Hamura's anger. She was leaning away from the fire user from where she sat on his left. The only Sekirei amongst his flock that did not seem affected by the fire-flinging Sekirei's wrath was Akitsu, who had looked up at him upon his outburst, then went back to eating in her slow, methodical manner. "He-heh," Uzume's customary chuckle filled with din. This coming from someone who has a nice rack. Hamura let loose a strangled noise that sounded suspiciously like eep. As he covered his rather prominent assets and sank back down to the floor, his face flushed as red as the fire he produced. It looked like someone forgot about their chest bindings today. Did this mean Hamura was getting more comfortable as a female, or was he still only half female? Naruto sighed. This whole situation was getting entirely too fucked up for his liking. Seriously, gender-changing aliens who bonded to humans due to an intense need to find a mate. If that wasn't Ika material, then he didn't know what was. "Uzume-chan," Chiho whispered in a hushed voice, her face aflame from her Sekirei's crass words. "Don't be so mean to Hamura-san." "Aw, come on, Chiho baby," Uzume gave her Ashikabi a pout. "You can't tell me you don't find it at least a little bit funny." The lithe girl, the cloth-using Sekirei, had bonded herself to flushed a bit, causing Uzume to giggle uncontrollably, which consequently earned a scowl from Hamura. Foo, Matsu let out her perverse giggling, covering her mouth with her hand as her glasses gleamed with an ominous, perverted glint. The hacker of Naruto's group was definitely enjoying this fiasco far too much for the blonde's liking. Though considering she was pretty much isolated to this inn, because she was on the run from MBI, Naruto could not begrudge the woman from having fun watching the others. The old Naruto would have probably found this situation amusing as well. "This is even better than a soap opera," Hamura glared at the red head. "I'm so glad you're enjoying yourself at my expense." "You don't need to be so rude," Tsukiyomi muttered, having hardly even paid attention to what had happened after Hamura's outburst. Instead, she was content giving her rival, not that she knew this, a glare of reproach. "I was merely stating my observations." "Your observations aren't wanted or needed," Hamura growled as he covered his chest. Naruto noticed that his voice sounded a lot less like a growl and a lot more like a squeak, almost like the fire user was going through a strange form of reverse puberty. Was this a part of the transformation process from male to female too? The part of Naruto that had grown since becoming immortal, that of the curious man who liked learning more about the world around him, wanted to see if he could get some X-ray scans of Hamura's anatomy to see if there were any significant changes to his physiology aside from the obvious physical changes. It would be interesting to see what he could find. "You're the one who's being rude," Hamura said loudly, his voice once more rising several octaves above what it should be. "Coming in here and calling me a woman. Watch your tone." Tsukiyomi stood up, her eyes narrowed in anger as she clenched her hands into fists at her side. "I won't tolerate being talked down to like this, least of all by someone like you." "Someone like me?" Hamura stood up again, his own eyes narrowed as he clenched his teeth. The fire hurler seemed to be getting more aggravated than usual, Naruto noted with interest. He wondered if it was that time of the month for Hamura. He was normally so composed. "What is that supposed mean?" "HMPH. Tsukiyomi tossed her hair behind her head in a gesture of haughty disdain. "It means exactly what I said. Someone like you has no right to insult me." "You're the one who insulted me," the The two Sekirei glared at each other as the others watched on. No one seemed ready to stop this argument from coming to blows, not even Mia. Surprisingly enough, she looked just as shocked that these two were about ready to start a brawl in the middle of dinner as everyone else. Thankfully, before this situation could devolve any further than it already had, help came from the most unlikely source. As one, all of the people within the living room, including Himura and Tsukiyumi, who by this point had been at each other's throats, turned to look at Matsu as Darth Vader's theme song sounded out from in between the red-haired hacker's breasts. Matsu herself blinked several times as she looked down at the rhombus cut out in her dress, where everyone could see the blinking lights of a vibrating cell phone. Just as Matsu was about to grab the cell phone, she looked up to see everyone staring at her and flushed red. "What?" she asked, as if having a vibrating cell phone playing Darth Vader's theme song was an everyday occurrence. "Nothing." Himura looked away from the shameless woman, his face red. Surprisingly, Tsukiyumi did the exact same at the same time. "How did I miss that?" Naruto wondered as he stared at the cell phone locked within the sweet embrace of Matsu's bosom. "Naruto," Mia said in warning, not that the blonde was actually listening to her. "Heh," Uzume chuckled. "I'm kinda surprised myself, especially after what we saw yesterday evening." She completely ignored her Ashikabi, crying out her name in an embarrassed manner as she gave Naruto a leer. "So am I," Naruto admitted with a shrug, causing Uzume to blink. Mia's left eye twitched as she was ignored by the blonde Uzumaki. Deciding it was not worth the effort, and knowing nothing she did would get the blonde to actually heed her warning, she instead turned her attention to Matsu, who had just taken out her phone and was now tapping on the touch screen. Matsu, the purple-haired landlady, said in a mild-mannered voice that belied her irritation. "I believe I already told Naruto-kun this, and you should know it well enough by now, but electronic devices are forbidden at the dinner table. Put your toy away for now, and you can get back to whatever it is you are doing after dinner." Unlike Naruto, who would have just continued doing whatever he was doing, Matsu decided she did not want to get on Mia's bad side and put the cell phone away. "In some place other than your chest, Matsu," Mia smiled pleasantly at the red head, causing her to pale. "I don't have anywhere else to put it," she complained, looking down at herself. Naruto observed her as well and had to admit she had a point. That dress had no pockets or even much in the way of excess fabric. The only place that had any more fabric than necessary were the sleeves of her arms, and there simply wasn't any way she could fit a phone in there. He briefly had an amusing thought of Matsu putting her cell phone in her panties, but shook it off just as quickly. Maybe Mia was right, and his beastly urges really were getting the better of him. "That's not my problem," Mia said without a care in the world. Matsu grumbled a bit as she realized what the woman wanted. Standing up, the perverted redhead walked out of the room, presumably to go back upstairs so she could put her phone away in her own room. With Matsu leaving, dinner resumed in relative peace. It seemed the woman's phone going off had the fortunate side effect of making Himura and Tsukiyumi forget they had been arguing in the first place. Now the pair were sitting down, ignoring each other as they ate. It wasn't much, but it was better than any of them could have hoped for given how things had been about to take a turn for the violent less than a minute ago. Naruto frowned as he looked at the two who had previously looked like they were going to be at each other's throats any second. He still didn't know how the two knew each other, and it was beginning to bother him. He would have to ask either one or both of them about their relationship later on. He also wanted to know why Himura was trying to keep the knowledge that he was the fire user's Ashikabi a secret from Tsukiyumi, especially when it was obvious that this was not the kind of secret that could be kept for very long. He supposed he could ask later on when he got the gender-confused Sekirei alone. It wasn't like the need to know was pressing or anything, just something he was curious about. Several minutes later, when Naruto and the others were about to clear the table, the sound of frantic footsteps sounded from outside of the room. They became progressively louder as the person running, Matsu presumably as she was the only resident living that was not currently sitting at the dinner table, began getting closer. A minute later, the door slid open with a suddenness that would have been startling had the sound of footsteps not informed everyone of the impending arrival. Even then, both Musubi and Kusano jumped at the sudden opening of the door. Matsu stood in the doorway, breathing heavily as she placed one hand on the door jamb and leaned against the other side of the door. "Matsu," Mia said in admonishment, a small frown adorning her fair features. "You know running in the house is forbidden." For once, Matsu seemed to completely ignore Mia's words as she turned her attention to Naruto. Said blonde straightened as he saw the expression on her face. It was surprisingly serious despite her still wearing her glasses. Before Naruto could ask what she had gotten so worked up about, Matsu spoke first. It was only 4 words, but it was 4 words nobody who had ever been a ninja enjoyed hearing. And for someone like Naruto, he enjoyed hearing them less than anyone else. The words were, "We've got a problem. Thanks for listening, I do hope you enjoyed it." If you want the next part of this video, subscribe and comment down below and turn on the bell notification, and also check out other videos that I have created and enjoy. Stay tuned for more exciting what if stories and other amazing videos coming your way. Until next time, take care, stay curious.